Welcome everyone to Pushing Past Imposter Syndrome with career coach Emily Baxt. My name is Amanda Raymond and it is my honor to serve as Associate Director of Alumni Career Engagement. And on behalf of UCLA Alumni Affairs, we welcome you to today's event, which is made possible by the support of our sustaining donors. So we want to thank those of you who have made a donation to keep our programs going throughout the year. For some housekeeping, if you have a question, please use the Q&A function below instead of the chat. We also, as you may have noticed, are recording today's session. So if you missed anything or would like to share this with a friend in the future, it will be made available to you. The UCLA Alumni Association seeks to bring together our amazing alumni and friends of UCLA to help us navigate complicated and interesting topics. For today's session, we will explore the nuances of imposter syndrome and discuss steps you can take to manage those feelings and recognize your career strength. Today's goal is for you to leave with action steps that will help you not only identify and own your strengths, but accept your successes. Today's speaker, Emily Baxt, principal at Baxt Consulting, specializes in professional growth and development for teams and individuals. She is an experienced, compassionate career counselor and coach who enjoys working with people to figure out their strengths and how they can benefit the world. Many of her clients are early to mid-career professionals, parents returning to work, or successful professionals looking for something more. She enjoys listening to her clients' stories, helping them identify barriers that may hinder success, and collaborating with them to identify next steps. Emily has a master's in counseling from University of San Diego and a Bachelor of Arts in Women's Studies from UCLA. So with that, I will turn it over to Emily.
Hi, Emily. Hi, thank you so much. And thank you for having me today. And welcome, Bruins. It's great to be back here with the UCLA family. As Amanda said, I am a Bruin from '92, and I always love working with UCLA alumni. So I've been working as a career coach and counselor and in team and leadership development for the past 20 years. I'm fortunate enough to work in a 50% contract with the University of San Diego in their Career Development Center, where I get to work with students, undergraduate and graduate students of all different majors and alumni of all ages. So it's fun for me to get to work with people in all those different career stages. Also, through my consulting work, I do a lot of team and leadership development, helping teams come together to communicate more effectively and work better for the goals of the organization. And I also do individual coaching. So this topic is particularly interesting to me because I see so many clients who come to me with this. Just to let everyone know kind of what we're doing today and where we're going, I'm going to talk and share about imposter syndrome and some of the different clients that I've seen and some of the ways that this shows up and some ways to approach those strengths. That'll be about 30 minutes, and then I'm happy to take questions. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you. All right, we're going to start with what is imposter syndrome? What are we talking about with this? So a quick definition is it's a false and sometimes crippling belief that one's successes are the product of luck or fraud rather than skill. Now, I think it's important to recognize too that imposter syndrome is not a diagnosis. So this is not something that shows up in the DSM-5. It's really a collection of behaviors or experiences that was first defined in the 70s by psychologists Eames and Clance. And their research really found that some of these people that they were working with had feelings of self-doubt and incompetence despite contradictory evidence. So these were people who were successful but felt like they shouldn't be successful. Another definition that I like, and some of the terms that we're going to be using today, I love this one. It's a distorted, unrealistic, unsustainable definition of competence. So really defining competence in a way that's unsustainable. And also, I think a way that we see it or it's experienced often is high achievers who feel like they're going to be found out as a fraud. So how it shows up. This can really show up when you undermine your expertise, your experience, or your worth. And there's a number of ways, again, that I see this. People will say things like, oh, I'm just lucky, or I was in the right place at the right time. Anyone could do what I did. I just work hard. So you can see how this is just a way of diminishing some of those accomplishments. This is one I hear a lot also. Oh, well, I only did this. I didn't do that. Like yes, I'm presenting at a conference, but it's just a regional conference. It's not like I got accepted into the national conference. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve this job offer. I don't deserve this acceptance into graduate school. I don't deserve this promotion. So I'll hear that with guilt, kind of, like, oh, I don't really deserve this. I've fooled everyone. Sometimes people will just say that to me, like, I feel like a big fake. I've fooled everyone. I'm a fraud, and they're going to find out. So there's this sense that somehow you have been misrepresented. People think that you are more competent than you are. And at any moment, this house of cards is going to come tumbling down. Who does this affect? So who's most affected by imposter syndrome? So it's important to recognize that many people will experience this at some time. Some of the research I read said up to 70% of people report having had feelings like this at some time or another. But the early research done by Ames and Clance were on women. So their research was on women, and that's the data that they collected. They found that this is something that affects women in the workplace. Also, other kinds of firsts. And when I say firsts in quotes, I mean people who are the first in a particular environment. This could be a first generation college student or somebody who differs in any way from the majority of their peers. So someone, say a woman who's going into a male dominated field, or a person of color who's going into a field dominated by white colleagues. Many people will feel this when they're embarking on a new endeavor. So for all of my recent college graduates and people about to graduate either from undergrad or graduate school, it's very common to feel this as you're transitioning or in that first job. So starting a new endeavor, it's really easy to feel like a fake. And this really happens across industries. So a lot of the research I read was in the sciences. So I think this is talked about quite a bit in physical and life sciences and research, but also in education, in business, definitely in the arts. It's something that I really, like I said, I really do see it in a number of industries, but I have a couple of quotes that I thought were interesting just to look at. I picked people in the arts. I picked 2 actors. One of them is quoted as saying, when I won the Oscar, so let's say right now, by the way, this is someone who won an Oscar. So I think they're pretty competent in their field. When I won the Oscar, I thought it was a fluke. I thought everybody would find out and they'd take it back. They'd come to my house knocking on the door. Excuse me, we meant to give that to someone else. That was going to Meryl Streep. So the person who said this was Jodie Foster. So Jodie Foster, who is a very accomplished actor. Another quote also from somebody in entertainment. You think, why would anyone want to see me again in a movie? And I don't know how to act anyway, so why am I doing this? This quote, well, this was Meryl Streep. So even Meryl Streep feels sometimes that she is out of her competence level or that she's going to be found out as a fraud. And I loved using those 2 as examples because you can see Jodie Foster is looking at Meryl Streep saying she's the one that should be getting the awards. And Meryl Streep, though, is having the same type of feelings as Jodie Foster. I'm going to transition from that into talking about how this shows up in my office and when I'm working with my clients. So I think I mentioned earlier, I work a lot with people who are completing a degree, and that could be undergraduate or graduate degree, professional degrees. One thing I've heard for years in my office is they're going to find out that I don't know how to do anything. So I think that's really, really common when completing an academic degree, this sense that like you're about to transition, but I don't know how to do any of the work. Like I don't know how to do anything. My clients in general, I think I see imposter syndrome or behaviors that could be thoughts that could be described as imposter syndrome. It's usually not the reason for their visit. It's not the thing that they're coming to see me for. My clients tend to be very high achieving, successful, either in academics or in their work, but they're meeting with me for different reasons. Like they want to apply to another job or, get promoted, apply to graduate school. But then they'll start talking. I'm looking at their resume going like, wow, this is super impressive with the things that they've done. But then they'll downplay their successes or tell me, that's when they start telling me like, well, I don't really deserve that. I just got that because they like me. I was lucky. So I'll hear some of those types of statements that make me then ask deeper questions. Some of my clients will have insight into this and they'll say straight out, oh, I have imposter syndrome. I don't think I should be doing this. Like I'm freaked out half the time about my job. But other times it's just the sense that they don't think they deserve it. I'm going to do a little sidebar here too, because I want to talk about luck, because we've talked about that word a few times. I think it's another thing I think is really important to recognize is privilege and happenstance and how those things play out in our careers. So certainly we all have seen how different identities and different privileges give people opportunities that other people do not have access to. So there are times when somebody will say to me, I got that interview because of my privilege. And that's true. And we can acknowledge that and talk about what that means. There are other times, though, when people will talk about luck as a way to discount and dismiss their skills, their achievements, and their talents. And that's when I will kind of take that conversation back and say, let's talk about what you mean by luck and how that impacts what you've accomplished. Okay, a specific example from my practice, I was working with a client who didn't think he belonged in school. So he was a veteran, non-traditional aged, and he'd applied to the university, gotten in, and was doing very well in his classes. And he had a successful career in the military, both in the technical field he was in and as a leader. And when I was meeting with him, I asked how his semester was going, and he just kind of shrugged, like, And finally he said, I don't belong here. I don't have anything to say. All of these young kids that came straight out of high school and they're all talking in class and they have a lot to contribute. I just sit in the back and I don't say anything. Like I'm not like them and I don't have anything to say. So that's, to me, that was someone where, and I'll talk a little bit about what worked with him later on in my presentation, but that was an indicator for me to think, oh, okay, I'm looking at the evidence and I see that you've been accepted and you're being successful in your work, but that was not his internal experience. Another client I worked with was a PhD who was looking for a job after he completed his postdoc. And he'd attended prestigious universities for his undergrad and his PhD and had a postdoc at a great institute. In fact, I was kind of intimidated to be working with him. I was like, okay, you are definitely a South Campus kind of person who's done very well. And he had been very successful academically and also in his job search. He had shared with me that he'd had a number of interviews and some great responses he'd received to his applications. But when I talked about that, he just shrugged off his accomplishments as sort of like, well, everyone can do that. He downplayed the successes. It was kind of like, yeah, I just worked hard. And yeah, that's what everybody has. And he said his interviews, definitely, he said his interviews were just because he was lucky. So that was another person that I thought, all right, let's unpack this a little bit. And again, I'll talk later what worked with this client and what helped him move forward. All right, from there, those are just kind of setting up what we're talking about with imposter syndrome. So let's move on to how can we push past this? If you've listened to that and you're thinking, yes, I have felt that way before, and many of us have, or if you're a manager, you might be thinking, I'm concerned that some of my people who report to me might feel this way, or they've even shared that with me. We're going to talk about some techniques and ways that we can move past it. One of the first is find support. So talk about it. Talking to a mentor in particular can be very, very impactful in this situation. So hearing about others' experiences can really normalize your own experience. And that's one thing that we recommend. It's like being able to talk to somebody who's been through it and somebody who can say, yeah, I feel that way sometimes too. Talking with a coach, working with a career coach, helping you reframe your thoughts and really be able to identify and own those strengths. So that's another technique that we'll look at, another person that can support you. Sometimes though, you may find that some of the thoughts and beliefs that kind of go around imposter syndrome are impacting both your mood and even other areas of your life. And in that case, I recommend that you reach out to a mental health professional if you want or need a deeper level of support. That's another way you can get support. But I think also just being in community. So our first level support, of course, is here with our Bruin family. So being able to reach out to people here is very helpful. And by here, I mean within our extended network. In addition to finding support, we're going to have to work on the thinking. So that's really what this comes down to, are these beliefs that may not be true. One thing that I work a lot with my clients is, let's reconsider your definition of competence. So people with imposter syndrome tend to define competence really, really high. It tends to be like this very almost unattainable, unsustainable level of competence. I thought of an example just this morning, and I asked my daughter if I could use her as an example. She said yes. So she is 16 and just got her driver's license. And the week before she had her test, we were practicing driving, and she started saying, what if a car came from this direction and turned here? What if a car and I both approach each other at a stop sign at the same time and they're not on my right and they go? Like, she was coming up with a lot of really complicated scenarios that could happen during her driver's test. And so we pulled over and I said, all right, you are not auditioning to be a stunt driver on the Fast and the Furious. You know, what the level of competence that you need to be a safe novice driver. That's all they're looking for in a driver's test, a safe novice driver. So we had to redefine what competence meant. And then we looked for evidence, tell me some evidence that supports your level of that competence. And then we were able to move forward with that. Perfection isn't the goal. So this is tied to that too. No one is perfect, no matter what it looks like on the outside. And as a worker, your goal is not to be perfect. You have to figure out what your goals are for competence or for whatever project you're working on, and reach those goals. Don't worry too much about perfection. Brene Brown does some great writing around perfection. For those of you who are familiar with her, I think the important concept I take away from that is that when I find myself striving for perfection, it's because I think it's going to make me invulnerable. No one's going to be able to critique me if I can be perfect. So that's something to think about and step away from. For me, I try to think, am I trying to be perfect, or am I trying to be good and help, or be good enough and competent in this area? And then the third, this is one of my favorite phrases: compare and despair. You've got to learn not to compare yourself to other people in a way that has negative implications for your own abilities. So don't compare your insides to other people's outsides. I think that's something, that a phrase I've seen going around a lot too. And that kind of ties into that whole Jodie Foster, Meryl Streep example we were looking at earlier. Jodie Foster was comparing her insides to Meryl Streep's outsides, but then Meryl Streep showed that her inside was, worried about competence as well. It goes without saying that in a world of social media, the comparisons are difficult to avoid. So that mentality, I think, carries over into our everyday life. But instead, I try to constantly get my clients to go back to like their here and now, what they're working on, and really looking at their growth and their next steps, how to define competence and how to have a growth mindset as they move forward. And this is really one of the most important things. You've got to acknowledge that your thoughts may not be correct. Just because you think something doesn't make it true. And that's kind of like a metacognition that you'll need to learn to start challenging these thoughts. And that's what this next slide we're going to look at. How do you actually, okay, let's say you're having these thoughts. You're able to maybe acknowledge that you are having a thought that could fit in with imposter syndrome. So it's noticing it and naming it, like, oh, I may be having an incorrect or a thought that's not true. What you want to do is look for evidence. So let's say you're thinking, I'll go back to my conference example. If you've submitted a conference proposal and it was accepted, and all of a sudden you realize, oh my gosh, I'm going to go to this conference. There's going to be all these experts there. They're going to say I'm a fraud. I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't want to do this after all. Like, I'm going to fail. This is just going to be terrible. Notice, okay, that sounds like imposter syndrome. I'm doubting my confidence. Acknowledge that those thoughts may not be correct. Maybe those things I'm thinking are not true about the conference. So now you're going to look for evidence. And the evidence in this situation might look like this. A group of my peers, the program committee, selected my proposal, which I wrote. They read that proposal. They found that it was well written. They found that it was sharing information that they wanted to learn. And they thought when looking at my qualifications that I was qualified to talk about that topic. All that evidence indicates that I'm probably competent to do this particular presentation. So then you have to restate that thought. So really rewrite it and say something different to yourself. Where your first thought might be, I'm not competent, they're all going to find out I'm a fraud. Reframe it by saying, I may not be an expert on every topic, and I may not even be an expert on this proposal topic, but I have something to share that my peers think is valuable and they want to learn that from me. So again, like reframing what competence means. I don't have to be the foremost expert on this topic, but then think what you do have to share. One other thing too, I want to talk briefly on this here is reframing thoughts. I see this a lot with my parents who are returning to work. So if I have anyone who's taken time off, mostly who I'm working with are parents who are returning to work, but sometimes people who've taken time off for caregiving or other reasons. Anything that a lot of these people have great experiences. Everyone has strengths that they've used. They've certainly been living a life while they are not in the workplace. But anything that happens outside of the paid environment, they will discount. Like, oh, but it wasn't paid. That was just volunteer work. That's something that doesn't, it's really diminishing. It was something that wasn't as valuable. So a lot of times working with my clients, let's try to actually look at the evidence and let's look specifically at what you did and how you can talk about that and what you learned from it and how you'll be able to transfer some of those strengths and skills into a different environment. That's a way of trying to get that evidence again. All right, I keep talking about strengths because this is really, I think, what workers and I say workers as a general statement, but the clients I'm working with, how can you determine your strengths so that you can talk back against some of these thoughts that you're having? I'm going to talk about a couple different techniques, but one of them is really starting with your accomplishments and your view of your accomplishments. And this is where you have to just get objective and make a list. Write down your successes and your accomplishments. You got a degree from UCLA. Write that down. Write down anything that is something you're proud of, something that you've accomplished. It can be academic, it can be in the workplace, it can be volunteer work, it could be something through another type of activity, but making some of those sort of like a measurable list. It's almost like, for those of you who may have to like compile things for an annual review, starting to compile like, what have I done? Another way to try to add to that list is identify what others rely on you to do. Like, what do other people ask you to do? And this can be in the workplace, but this can be in other areas of your life as well. Really trying to figure out what people rely on you for, because that tends to indicate things you're good at. Once you've made that list, look at it and say, can I own these accomplishments? Do I hear myself trying to diminish them or say, well, that doesn't count or that doesn't matter? And the goal is to really be able to say, yes, I did that. I accomplished it. It was because of work I did. If you can't own it or you find yourself diminishing it, go back to that previous exercise and try a reframing. Look at how you're measuring competence, come up with evidence, and then reframe that thought. This kind of list starts to give you clues to your strengths. When you're looking at accomplishments and what you do well and what others lean on you for, that helps you see sort of where your talents lie. This is something I do a lot, by the way, for my people who are getting ready to graduate or who have recently graduated. This is something I work on a lot with my new grads. Those people earlier I mentioned who say things like, I don't know how to do anything. Let's look at what you've accomplished and what you do have, the strengths you have, the skills you've developed, the experiences you have, and really own those before you start stepping to that next role and start seeing how we can make those connections and those bridges. All right, another way to really look at your strengths and try to determine what your strengths are is getting an outside view. What do others think of you? And this can be a really eye-opening perspective. Go back and look at your formal or informal reviews. If you have any sort of written review process from past jobs or a current job, look at those. Another thing I encourage people to do is when you get a thank you note, an email, or anything written down, create a place where you can save those. Create a folder in your email or on your desktop and start throwing those things in there. You can go back through and mine those for themes, but you can also use them when you are starting to feel incompetent to go back through and say, no, actually, I have made a difference. People appreciate the work I've done. Look at these things that I've accomplished. You can also get direct and just ask people for feedback. So find people you're comfortable with, talk to like your work group or other peers and say, okay, how do I help you? Like, what am I mean, if you know them really well, you can just say, what am I good at? But you can also ask, like, what are the pieces that I contribute to this workspace or to this team? What do people rely on me for? How do I help you get your job done? And being able to get some of that more informal feedback that way. You can also make this into a more structured process. So I have an article in my resources slide so you can access this. But it was an article published in the Harvard Business Review, I think about 10 or 15 years ago. It's not new. And it defines something called the reflected best self exercise. And basically the way it works is you email people you've worked with before, former supervisors, current colleagues, teachers, coaches, anyone who you think has spent some time with you, and you ask them to please give you 3 stories talking about a time you were successful. And so you'd be surprised about how many people are happy to provide this kind of positive feedback. So you send off your emails, you get the information back, and then the article walks you through a process of sort of how to read through these, combine them or measure sort of like what themes come out and what you can take away from that about what it means, how others see your strengths. So looking for that outside view is a way to get out of your own head and really see how others view you. This is what worked for the client I was talking about earlier, taking that outside perspective. One of my clients, the one who I was talking about, who was a veteran and a student, I was asking him, we were working on a cover letter for him actually. So I was trying to pull his strengths out of there. We were looking at a specific job and I was asking him how his experiences or strengths tied to what they were asking for in that job. And he was having just a really difficult time acknowledging any of those strengths. And finally, what I said is, all right, tell me how your unit would describe you. Think back to your last unit you worked with in the military. How would they describe you if I was asking them who you are and what you're about? And that was the question that helped him get out of his own head. He started laughing and described who he was and how they saw him and what his strengths were and what his nickname was. And then we were able to work backward from there. I said, okay, great. Let's look at those. What strengths do you think? Why do you think that they were so happy with you? Why do you think that they loved you so much that they gave you a nickname? What was it about that? And so we really were able to start identifying, and he was able to own some of those strengths. And then we were able to look at how those applied to him as a student and how they applied to him as an applicant for this job. But he had to get out of his own head and think about how others would have viewed him. One tool that I like to use as a coach, I like to use strengths assessments sometimes. So the assessment I use in particular is called Clifton Strengths. It used to be called Strengths Finder for those of you who maybe have taken it before in previous years. Some of the reasons why I like it is it really provides language around strengths. So Clifton Strengths looks at 34 different talent themes and helps identify the top 5 for people. It gives people a way to talk about their strengths, but it also validates their experience. I've had so many clients look at their report and say, oh, I never really thought of that as a strength before. That's just what I do. It's kind of who I am. But this is a way to start validating some of those talents as strengths. And the reason I like it as a coach is because it really can lay out a framework for people to start looking both at their past and their future. And I have, this is a page of what the report might look like, so I can tell you how I would use that. So if somebody had focus as one of their top strengths, you can see here the shared theme description, which is just a quick description of the strengths, is people exceptionally talented in the focus theme can take a direction, follow through, and make the corrections necessary to stay on track. They prioritize, then act. So if I'm working with a client, I'll say, tell me how that looks for you. Where have you done that in the past? Or how has that contributed to some of your successes in the past? And they have to start telling me a story and really seeing and understanding how this strength has helped them in a very specific way. when I can get someone to do that, it makes it, it's easier for them to help integrate that success. If they're talking about an accomplishment or a success that they've had, and they're having to describe how their strength helped them accomplish that success, they can start to internalize that they did something to make that accomplishment happen. They can start owning that in a way. It makes it a lot harder to say like, oh, that's just something that happened, or that's just something I was lucky, or they liked me, or any other way to dismiss it. It's a way to really start integrating that, and that's how why it's valuable to me as a coach. But it's also valuable because we can use it directing toward the future. As I'm working with somebody who's coming upon career challenges or next steps or any other type of transition, we can say, okay, this is one of your strengths. How is that going to help you with this challenge? How can you apply that in this particular situation? And we can start coming up with ways that they can move forward successfully using these strengths that have already helped them be successful in the past. All right, managers, those of you who are working with people who may have told you that they feel like a fraud, or maybe you're worried that they're thinking that and they're not telling you. A lot of the things that I've shared already are things that you can help your reports with, the people you manage, to help you with. But I also pulled, again, in my references, I'm going to have the information for an article I looked at from the Forbes Human Resources Council, and I went through the different tips they had in addition to the ones I've already shared. And I think it's really important to normalize this set of thoughts and feelings. So let your reportees know, hey, sometimes people feel like this when they're new in this role, particularly when they're first taking on the job or taking on the role. So normalizing it is really helpful, addressing it and talking about it, but then also help coach them through. So this is where normalizing it, talking about it, that provides that support, but then sort of help walk them through that reframing process. That's one way that you can really help them see not just that it's okay to feel this way and it's normal, but how do they move past it? One thing that is a wonderful technique for managers is offer specific positive affirmation. Really tell them exactly what they're doing right. And this is something you may be doing already. It may be something that you do formally or informally, but I think it's very helpful, rather than say you're doing a great job, being able to give something very specific. The way that you were able to integrate those metrics into the report helped us make the sale. So being able to give them some specific affirmation around their strengths. I recommend too, it's great to share that type of affirmation verbally, but I also encourage managers, add it to an email. Hey, as I said to you earlier today, this is what I appreciate what you did. Being able to write that down. That way, some people need to see things to really read them, but also it gives them a chance to read it over and over and check in with it when they're wondering about their strengths or how they're contributing to the team. I work with a lot of managers who also work in companies that leverage strengths-based assessments, which I think can be really helpful for the reasons I mentioned before. The Clifton Strengths is a tool that is designed for managers to use with their reports when they're coaching them. So that being able to have some of that language and some of that structure, I think, can be really helpful. And that was one of the things that was also recommended by the council. I think in general, being able to identify this, talk about it, let people know they're not the only one, but also show them how you're going to help them get past it. That's really key. I know there were some questions earlier. I should have said I did read all of the questions that you all submitted before the webinar, so thank you. And as I mentioned in the earlier slides, people who are firsts or who are different from the majority of their peers are more likely to feel imposter syndrome. So anyone who is different from the majority, and so that could be around any type of identity. It can be around gender, it can be around ethnicity, it can be around sexual identity. So really being, one of the questions, this is a long setup, sorry, but one of the questions was, how can I as a white supervisor help my BIPOC employees through some of these imposter syndrome issues? And so I think these same types of tips, being able to identify it, normalize it, and I think too, being able to talk, pull some of the articles, pull the research, and be able to speak knowledgeably about how identity does come into play with this. And being able to acknowledge that as a supervisor, I think can be really powerful and say, look, I know this is something that happens to a lot of people. Here's how it shows up sometimes. Here's what the research shows. Here's how I'm going to help. If you feel this way, it's fine to talk about, and here's how I can help you through it. So I think being able to really show that support and that you care about all of your reportees as a manager. This is my resources slide, which I'm just throwing out here quickly, so it'll show up on the video later, and you can go back to it and look at it if you want to. And I'm happy now to take any questions that you've put into the Q&A. Amanda's gonna toss them to me. Before I move to questions too, I wanna show also on the slide, I've got my LinkedIn address on here. You're welcome to link in with me or to contact me through my website has my email address. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing, Amanda.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. I think that was super helpful in clarifying and unpacking the whole concept of imposter syndrome. We have a number of questions, but the first one that I thought was a good one to start with is, how does imposter syndrome differ from low self-esteem?
So that's a great question. And it's a little challenging because the term is not, like I said, it's not a diagnosis. So it's not a very specific term. But the way I frame that in my head is people with low self-esteem often think they're unable to have success or unable to achieve certain things. Whereas imposter syndrome, they have achieved those things, but they think they don't deserve to have achieved them, or that they achieve them through some sort of luck, or they dismiss their participation in that accomplishment.
Okay, great. That's a great way to differentiate. Now, this is like a common saying that we hear a lot, fake it until you make it. So how do you have that fake it till you make it mentality without, then dipping into, oh, I'm being an imposter,
Yeah, that I think, again, it comes down to that reframing. So fake it till you make it is great in certain settings. Of course, we don't want, like, I don't know, our surgeon to fake it till they make it. So we're looking at levels of competence when we talk about fake it till you make it. So this is where I think I would turn to that, really looking at the definition of competence. So seeing, okay, I'm going to fake it till I make it. Is the feeling I'm having that I am not worthy or don't know enough, is that because I am measuring what competence looks like so high, like that I have to be like a professional, experienced marketer when I'm being hired for an entry-level marketing position? So maybe what you have to think is, okay, they don't expect me to do the entire marketing strategy for this company. I've been hired to come in and help manage the social media. So the part I'm going to fake is my confidence until I feel more confident. So it's more doing it that way. But in terms of like my actual work, reframe what confidence looks like, reframe those thoughts too, and being able to say, like, actually, I can do X, Y, and Z. I already know Google AdWords. I had that internship and I took those classes. I am competent to do the work that they've hired me to do. And now the part I'm going to fake is the fact that I'm like smiling when I get in there.
Okay. And then I know you ended with the concept of like being a manager. So someone submitted a question on how to manage the imposter syndrome in regards to fears that their reports think of them as a fraud or not a good leader. And how do you guide clients who may be struggling with that?
So just to clarify, is the question the manager feels like has imposter syndrome, fearing that
Yes.
they're not being
And
a
they
good
feel
leader?
that the reports don't think they're a good leader or they don't deserve their role.
So this kind of goes into, I'm going to kind of take it into another question as well that I saw ahead of time, which is, how do you know when you have imposter syndrome, and how do you know when you're actually not doing a good job or not able to do the work? So that's, I think, where we have to get really objective and look at a skills gap analysis. So sort of, what is the goal? What is it that I'm trying to accomplish? And in this case, being a leader. So being able to define in your particular role, what does it mean to be a good manager? What is needed? Is it that you are required to provide certain metrics or accomplish certain things for your organization and provide support for the people who report to you. And if that's the case, look at some objective measurement, if you can, to think, am I achieving those goals? Am I setting my competence? Am I making competence something that's unsustainable and unattainable? Like all of my employees must love me all the time and tell me, like that's probably never going to happen, just because of human nature. But if you evaluate everything and the issue is like, I think I'm lacking some trust in my team. How can I accomplish that? How can I gain trust? And then really working with your whatever that leadership skill development maybe needs to be around some of that areas. But if you realize, if you look and think, you know what, I'm really doing a good job, then it's a matter of trying to determine what you can do to just continue to improve and grow, what you can do to help your team. And also, I always come back to the question too, is like, do you know for sure that they don't think you're confident? And how do we know, like, so really being able to work on that trust is probably the piece I would go with.
Okay, and so then this is on the flip side as an employee. So this person is asking, how can we give feedback to our direct managers in hopes that they would incorporate more specific positive affirmation in their management style to the team?
Every situation is different, of course, but I encourage people to ask for what they need. So many people, when they are managing, they will manage in the way that feels good to them. So some people like a lot of affirmation, and as a manager, they'll give a lot of affirmation. Some people think that it's better to be really hands off and only provide feedback to help somebody when things are going wrong, kind of to redirect them. So I would recommend that in a one-on-one with your manager, let them know what you need. So being able to say, thank you so much. This was really helpful about this. One thing that helps me is if I can get some specific feedback from you, both on what I'm doing right and what I'm doing wrong. What would be the best way for me to, how can we do that? So even in a one-on-one, being able to ask questions, like being able to say, what should I keep doing? What should I do less of? And what should I do more of? That's a great way to get specific feedback from a manager if you're not getting that just from them naturally.
We have a few questions that are surrounding privilege. So we have a question about how do you reconcile the feelings of imposter syndrome with understanding aspects of privilege?
Yeah. So, I think this is the piece that we are all untangling and will continue to be untangling and have been untangling. But as I mentioned earlier, we cannot deny that there is privilege that comes into play when we're talking about who gets an interview, who gets a job, who gets a promotion, who gets accepted to a conference. All of these different accomplishments I'm talking about. Privilege opens doors. And some people have some privilege and some people have other privilege and some people don't have it. So that's one thing. I think just acknowledging that reality comes first. But then from there, looking at how that plays into imposter syndrome, it's being able to say, yes, I have, and I'll talk about this both from someone who has privilege in a certain way and someone who doesn't. So yes, I have privilege and that probably helped me with X, Y, and Z. However, I accomplished these things through additionally these experiences, these talents, these strengths, these skills that I have applied. So I think it's a combination of understanding how you have contributed to your accomplishments and your successes and owning that you did contribute to them and that wasn't just luck, but also I think really looking hard at how has privilege helped me? How has this particular privilege I have helped me every step of the way from elementary school all the way on up. So I think it's really having a balance of those. For people who lack, who do not have privilege or have, trying to think of a better way of saying that, but people who have imposter syndrome who also, did not have privilege and that has held them back in certain ways or certain opportunities have not been available to them because of that. Then I think it's really, again, doubling down on looking at the specific contributions that you have made and how you have accomplished those things, and then recognizing that in addition to those accomplishments, you had to work harder, go farther, do better, and do more to get to this level that you're at, wherever that is with accomplishment, and give yourself credit for that as well.
Great, thank you.
And just another piece on that too, I'm sorry, I thought of one more thing, Amanda. I think being able to talk to people about that is very important. So being able to find people who can relate to that aspect of privilege or identity and talk with them about their experience is very, very valuable. That's an important step. And then later on, it's being able to talk with people who have different identities and different level of privilege about that.
Right. And kind of going in a little deeper, there was a question on how on the topic of privilege, how do I overcome the feeling that I'm not good enough when I know my work is good, but my more privileged peers are telling me that I'm not good enough? And then the scenario is specifically the example she or he gives, oh no, it moved, was in the hiring process. So, this person feels that he or she is an ideal client and up until the in-person interview. So kind of feeling like on paper, everything's going, and then the interview happens and the feedback is a little different, and feeling that, unpacking.
So I'm sorry, go back to because I got so wrapped up in that situation. I was like, what?
Sorry. And then
go back to the question, because I want to make sure I catch the tie into imposter syndrome. So I'm sorry.
Okay. So on the topic of privilege, how do I overcome the feeling that I'm not good enough when I know my work is good, but my more privileged peers are telling me that I'm not a good fit?
Yeah.
And this is in hiring decisions.
Yes. Okay. So first of all, now that we're kind of headed down this road, can I acknowledge my own imposter syndrome and say, I'm not an expert about talking about privilege, but I am just talking about it through my experience. So I have to start with that. In this particular situation, when you are being told by people that you are not as good, or, in hiring, you're not getting that positive feedback, you're not getting moved forward, I think you really have to double down on your evidence, and go back to that internal focus, being able to say, no, I accomplished this. I know I'm good at this. This is my strength. There's a million situations where people may not recognize that. I think there's a lot of companies that are still locked into this idea of culture fit instead of culture add. So sometimes those types of issues can come into play. But I think it's really being able to step back and think, rename your strengths, understand that this one situation is not going to define you or not define you, and keep moving forward, identifying how your strengths and how what you've done has contributed to your accomplishments, and move on to that next place.
Okay, great. So this question is, do you have any advice for someone who's struggling with self-sabotage, in the sense that I know I could learn and gain experience and want to learn new things, but stop myself from applying for certain positions because I don't have the experience? So how do you kind of manage that balance?
Well, this kind of goes back to that, like looking at that competence and how you're defining competence. So this is a related issue that I see with a lot of my clients who are looking at jobs and will say, I don't have all of the things that they want on the job listing. Like I think I could do the job, but I only have 70% of what's listed on that job description. I don't have every single bullet. So that's really a reframing too, and understanding that the person who wrote that job description, they were writing a wish list. They were writing every single thing that they could think of for a dream candidate. They know that that person probably doesn't exist. And if they do, they're not applying to that job, but they're kind of throwing it out there. So I really encourage my clients, if you see a job that you look at and you think, I could do that job, sort of what you're describing here, I have the skills, I've learned new things. But if you think that maybe you don't have the exact experience or you don't have everything they've asked for, go ahead and apply, because, let them say no to you. Otherwise, you are self-sabotaging. You're saying no before they have a chance to say yes. So I really encourage people. This is something where I see a big gender split too. I don't know if the gender of the person who asked that question, but if you are a woman, I'm going to tell you that this is an issue I see much, much more often with women than with men. Men, because of the way that they're raised and taught and trained, are much more likely to look and say, I can do that. I'm going to throw my hat in the ring. Whereas women will look and say, I don't have every single thing on the list, so I'll wait till I find a job that really, that I fit perfectly before I apply. So that's another thing to think about when you are kind of having those self-sabotaging thoughts. And again, make that list of all the accomplishments and the skills that you have and look at them and think, if you think to yourself, I could do that job, go ahead and apply.
Right. And this next question kind of builds off of self-sabotage. What are some solutions what solutions come up when you have imposter syndrome so bad that it then becomes severe and it causes performance anxiety?
Mhm.
So
I mean,
how do you handle that?
if you are finding that these types of thoughts are really getting in the way of your everyday life, as I said before, I encourage you to reach out to a mental health professional. To just even a few sessions can really help to work specifically on that issue. So being able, sometimes we've got to untangle these kinds of things we've talked about with imposter syndrome. They can be tangled up with anxiety, other mood disorders. It can be tangled up with other issues. And it can be really helpful to unpack that with a trained professional and find some specific action steps that'll help you and get you to the point where you can feel like you can move forward.
I know you mentioned that you had seen some questions in advance to today's session, and so had I. And it was interesting. I was kind of processing the information and realizing that a lot of this imposter syndrome is not just early career, it really follows people throughout their lifetime. And so this question was, how can older individuals manage imposter syndrome in the eyes of younger employees who may or may not have a more senior position?
Um,
The flip.
yeah. So like how can people who are more experienced deal with imposter syndrome?
Right.
Um, so yes, I know some of the information I shared showed that this is very common whenever someone's starting a new endeavor, but that's really not related to age, and it's also not exclusive to that group. So the further up we go in our career, I mean, often you're still entering a new stage, entering a new level, taking on that management role, whatever it is as you're moving up. So I think all of the same things apply. But I also think that people who've worked, have quite a bit of experience, any of us can develop imposter syndrome. We're really thinking about those same concerns. What I would recommend, I think, again, it's going back to those accomplishments. You have done a lot of things. You know, the longer we're in the workplace, the more experience we have, the more accomplishments and successes. And it's a way to make sure that you write those down and own them. And I think for older workers, sometimes really thinking, why did I make the choices that I made in my career? Why have I made the choices I've made in my life? What values does that tie to? Often with my older clients or more experienced clients, there's a concern of comparison. So we get back to that compare and despair. Like, oh my gosh, so and so who I graduated with is now doing this incredible, amazing thing. I'm doing this thing, and I'm not even sure I should be here. You know, I'm not even sure I should be in this level. So if that's the case, I really try to say, well, let's talk about why you took the path you did, and what are the positives about that. And sometimes, again, that can help integrate and own those successes, to help you feel comfortable and confident where you are.
And we have a question that is kind of a clarification on some of the stuff that you've covered. So,
Sure.
what is cultural fit and cultural add?
Oh, great question. Yes. Sorry, I just threw those out. I think for years when people were doing hiring, there was a lot of talk about fit. We want to find somebody who fits our company. We want to find somebody who fits the culture. And from some of the literature that I've been reading and the research that's happening in HR, um, of course, if I'm hiring somebody I'm comfortable with, it's probably somebody who's a lot like me. So that could be around identity, or it can be around work style. It could be around strengths. There's a lot of things. But if I say like, oh, they fit with the organization, it's a way of continuing sort of like homogeneity. So a lot of companies now, when they're doing hiring, they're trying to take the perspective of culture add. What is this candidate adding to our culture? So it's less about looking at like, how are we getting them to fit and make sure everyone's the same, but how are we doing culture add? And that can, again, can be around any type of identity or age, experience, academic background, a lot of different ways. It's a way of looking, again, at diversity of the workplace as a strength.
Great. I think with that, I think we're kind of at time and all these great questions. Thank you everyone for submitting them and participating in today's event. I hope you all can just join me in thanking Emily for leading today's insightful session. Emily, the information you shared is so needed, and your insights and strategies on how to handle imposter syndrome is so valuable to us all at different points of our lives. So thank you so much for sharing with us today. I also want to thank all of you for participating in today's session. I hope you will tune in to our future sessions hosted by UCLA Alumni Affairs. I hope everyone has a great day, and go Bruins.
Thank you. Go Bruins.